Akshay, did you always knew what you wanted to do when you passed out from MBA?
I was all over the place. Saurabh, what about you?
यार मेरे को तो तब भी आइडिया नहीं था, आज भी आइडिया नहीं है.
Confused about your career choices? Wondering what steps to take next? In this podcast called Beyond Campus, Saurabh Garg, founder of C4E, and Akshay Dutt, founder of Unnati, are on a mission to crack open the career success code for the youth. वो बचपन में कहते थे ना, तुम जो चाहे बन सकते हो. So, let's turn the dream into reality.
Hi, this is Krishna Jonnakadla, founder of Maharajas of Scale and co-founder of FLIT, the Fashion Locator In Town.
Imagine a teenager negotiating finances of a film with a movie megastar. Sounds unreal, right? Our guest today is Krishna Jonnakadla, founder of Maharajas of Scale. His journey to become an entrepreneur is as interesting as it gets. From entertainment to fashion to technology, Krishna has delved in various sectors and is driven by his passion to constantly discover something new. Listen to him sharing his life experiences, lessons, and more in this episode of Beyond Campus.
I grew up in a rather notorious part of Bangalore, which was more famous for breeding a variety of underworld dons as opposed to businessmen or entrepreneurs. The only difference was that my mom comes from a business family, and funnily enough, I would always look forward to spending all my summers way back at my mom's native place, which is Chittoor in Andhra Pradesh, on the way to Tirupati, because they had a buzzing business. Ever since I was 8 or 9, I would just completely immerse myself in accounting or stock taking and stuff like that. So,
What was the business?
the family is into a variety of businesses. One is distribution of FMCG products, Cadbury's, ITC, and there was also film distribution. The family used to finance films and then distribute films in that part of the region. So one of the things that I have done at a very young age, when I was 13 years old, was having the good fortune of negotiating a film with N.T. Ramarao, who's a big icon in the Telugu film industry. And I not only oversaw the negotiation, the financing of the film, and I kept complete end-to-end track of the profitability of that film for our family at the age of 13.
You're kidding me. At the age of 13, you went up to all these grown-ups and told them, no, this is what we're going to pay you. I mean, how did they take you seriously?
I think it has got more to do with what the amount of faith my uncle had in me. I think this was 1993 or 1992. NT Ramarao, or NTR as he was commonly known, had shot another film, and he hadn't shot a film in quite some time. And we had produced a bunch of films. One of the films the family had produced was Armor of God in the mid 80s, which was a Jackie Chan film, and the family had made quite a bit of money on that. And I got fascinated.
They produced Armor of God. They were the production company. Wasn't that like a Hong Kong-based setup?
They financed it. They distributed and financed it in the South.
Okay, got it.
So this was because NTR hadn't done a film in some time. This was going to be expected to be a big hit, and I actually told my uncle I would love to be a part of the negotiation, and that was just my chance of seeing the actor himself. He said, "Would you like to negotiate?" I said that would be awesome. So all he did was he said he gave me a range. If my memory serves me right, we want to spend no more than 3 lakh rupees, and our range is 2.5 lakhs to 3 lakhs. And because I was a kid, I was around people who would just keep chatting what was possible, what was not possible. So I bid 2.75 lakhs on that film, and then we won the bid for that part of Andhra Pradesh, and that's how we bought the film.
And during school, did you think that you were going to become an entrepreneur and follow your mother's side of the family, or was it more towards your father's side? Your father was a government employee, right?
Yeah. In fact, my great grandfather was a entrepreneur as well. The equivalent of Haldirams for Bangalore, he ran that for a long time, and those were that was way back in the 1920s. But there was a lot of vagary in business, as a result of which my grandfather decided that he did not want to be in business, and he ended up being an engineer, and it spawned a bunch of professionals in my family. But my heart was set on business, and at a very, I think around that time, maybe even earlier, when I was in fourth grade or fifth grade, I had long decided that if I was going to do something in life, it was going to be having my own business and having my own organization. So the next leap actually happened when Gary Hamel and C.K. Prahlad visited India. I think I was in the 11th at that point in time. They had just released a book called The Future of Competition. And that was also the time I was starting to get very fascinated with business stories. And I decided that I am going to.
How old were you at that time?
I was, I think, 16. So the theory of core competence that they spoke about, for some strange reason, I could understand it very, very clearly. And then I said, yeah, this is fantastic. And those were the early days of the internet, and I would read a lot. I've had a lifelong reading habit, and I decided one day I'm going to do a tech startup. And in my last year of chartered accountancy, I was actively looking for ideas, and a friend's friend was throwing around an idea of building a case flow automation software for legal firms. So essentially, to put it in perspective, an average individual has possibly, he doesn't have any legal cases, but if you do, you're wondering about when is the next hearing, what are the acts that affect me, what are my chances, what are the case laws. But for an average corporation, they have hundreds and thousands of lawsuits. So for them, how do they keep tab on when the next hearing is, who needs to appear, what sort of evidence needs to be submitted? So both for law firms and corporations, this was a compelling need. And this guy was toying around with the idea of building something. He had an initial prototype. So we team tagged together. And we were both still in our internship, so to speak. We didn't have real jobs yet. So we said, how are we going to fund this? We said, let's start a training institute. Way back then, even today, engineering was very popular. So students would come to training institutes to do final year projects, so-called personal projects. So we started a training institute. We trained hundreds of students. We would charge a small fee, and we took all of that money and put it into product development.
Your friend was an engineer?
He was an engineer. He was a techie.
And so how did the idea of a software for lawsuits come about? Like, did he have an understanding of how that whole thing works, or like what was the genesis of that?
He actually had a neighbor who was an advocate, and that the two of them were in discussion for quite some time, but neither of them had any expertise. This guy had some notions. They didn't know how to price it. They didn't know how to take it to market. They didn't know any of that. And then they had an outsized view that only they could create IP for the product. Yes, you couldn't get the IP without an attorney being involved and then maybe getting inside access to a legal firm. That is what would shape the product. But that was the spark.
So then you started this business, you and your friend, and was the attorney also a stakeholder in that?
he was supposed to be a stakeholder, but until the very end, his role was not really clear.
So how did the whole business get off its feet? And so you did tell me that you funded it through the coaching
Yeah.
business that you started.
Yeah. So the venture itself lasted about 2.5 years. So in the meantime, we had some wildly differential pricing. So for one firm, we would offer a lifetime license for 600 rupees. But for somebody like Hindustan Lever, which had its administrative offices in Brookfield, which is near Whitefield, Bangalore, we had offered it at 40,000 rupees. So it was the exact same copy, and we had no method to the madness. There was no branding. So I put all of that in place. And also to create decent UI UX, repeatable packaged software, because it was custom implemented everywhere. It was not going. There was no need for it to be an ERP because it was repeatable everywhere. But what happened was there were some integrity issues that came up. We were co-investing together, and then the money that I was investing, the other co-founder was siphoning it off in some other fashion. And another aspect was there was a personal family tragedy. My father suffered a stroke. He was the bread earner till then. And I always told myself that my father is young, we have our own house. I could take all sorts of risks in my life. I could be adventurous with what I do with my professional life. And it so happened that we lost both of that due to a litigation situation. We were thrown out of our ancestral home. My father was bedridden for about a year. So I just started a new job. So I could no longer invest in that venture. So I left it to my co-founder. I said, do whatever you want with it. I also have some integrity issues that have come to light with you anyway. And I think this is the right time to pull out. And then I pulled out. That's where, the first venture ended.
How did you become a techie, even though you did a commerce graduation and then you did a CA qualification?
So I'm a builder and a tinkerer. I've been that ever since I was a kid. So for instance, so if something went kaput, I would open it up. I would just see what was going on with it, and then I would fix it myself. I was just truly fascinated with how things work. And eventually, I guess the fascination with computers was just an extension of that. I was fortunate that very early on, when I was in college, I was still in first year or 10th grade. I asked my father for a computer, and my father would very rarely buy me new clothes, but he never blinked an eye to buy a computer. He bought me a computer when I was very young. So yeah, it's been a fascination since then with tech.
So you were entirely self-taught. Like you learned, you built the UI UX for that product, so you must have learned some front-end programming.
I still do some programming. I do SQL. I do some amount of Python and PHP, but no heavily involved coding. I'm not a coder, but I can understand the tech concepts, in a fair amount of detail.
So why a commerce graduation degree then? Why not go for a BTech?
There's a totally different story for that. I've always believed in forging a different path. Never wanted to be another cookie from a cookie cutter factory. I've had original opinions, original thoughts. So much so that when I was young, I don't know if you remember, Leher 7-Up used to be a drink. And then there used to be this character called Fido Dido. It was this caricature. And you used to have all of these contests, right? So 50 bottle caps, and then you get a poster, and 200 bottle caps, and you get some kits and stuff. So I had traded 50 bottle caps for a poster because I loved that character so much, and that punchline said normal is boring. And although I scored very high in my 10th grade, which usually determines whether you can get into science or commerce, my father actually said, "You've always been somebody who thinks different. Yeah, there are quite a few engineers and doctors in our country, but my role is just to finance your education. You choose what you want to be." I said, "Dad, I've always wanted to do something in business, so I'm going to go into commerce." Uh, and that's how I ended up in commerce. The CA is more of a proving a point, so to speak. In spite of my father being an engineer, my cousins, a couple of my cousins went to the IIT, and their father, in fact, made fun of the weird thing is, as much as I was connected, I never knew that an institution like the IIT existed until I came to 11th grade, and I had already chosen commerce, so it was already too late by then. So they said, this uncle said, "Your sons are absolutely worthless. They're incapable people. They're not going to amount to much in life. It is good that they're in commerce." So it was too late to turn back and prove a point. So I said, "Okay, what's the equivalent of IIT in the commerce field? It is a chartered accountancy. So let me show you that I can do it." And that was how I signed up for chartered accountancy. And I was working, I was studying, and I was doing my BCom degree, all of them at the same time, and taking care of family.
You were working in what way?
So when you take up your CA, you work as an article clerk. So in some sense, it's like a very poorly paid slave, white collar slave. So yeah, getting paid 300 rupees on a monthly basis as an article clerk. So
and you were doing like audit and accounting entries and all of that.
Yes. Doing audits, management reviews, and I was a distinction student in accounting as well. So all of this accounting stuff came very, very naturally to me.
So when did you join your first job? When you decided that you can't be running that company with the legal product?
So my first job actually was in the year 2000, after my articleship, and it was with the same firm. Today it's a part of, I think, E&Y. And so it was at that time I started that venture. So 2000 was when I began working, and 2002 is when I called it quits. By that time, I had started working at KPMG.
So after these about 2 years you spent at KPMG, then what next?
I actually joined a startup called Quintent, which was founded by Fanish Murthy of the infamous Fanish Murthy. And I joined as their consulting, offshore consulting lead. And that was how that Quintent got bought by an organization called iGate. Today, it is a part of Capgemini. And I went to the US to manage their actually scale and build their consulting practice, and was very successful at that.
Okay, and what exactly was it like?
It was a couple of practices. One was a business strategy practice that was focused on reducing costs, identifying, because offshoring and then global location of processes and operations was such a in thing then. Where to locate the process, how to assess the readiness of internal system to undergo that massive shift in strategy. That was one consulting practice. The other consulting practice was about financial risk management. So there was a congressional act that was passed back then called Sarbanes-Oxley, which put a lot of onerous requirements on managements to audit, review, analyze, and then disclose a lot of their internal risks. Managements had to, the audit firms still existed, and fresh off of Arthur Andersen's Enron fiasco, this required internal management certification. So that was another practice. So we built a lot of proprietary tools, frameworks, a lot of the blockchain stuff we see today, for instance, where you need 2 sets of truth or maybe 5 sets of truth so that you can't erase it. There were versions of those which we had created early on back then. So it was on the back of that those 2 consulting practices were created.
Okay. Then, so how long was your stint there with IG?
Close to 6 years.
Then what next?
Next, in that meantime, did another startup called Red Litmus. And Red Litmus was a review aggregation startup. Essentially, suppose, let's say you're in Reliance Digital or Best Buy, you're looking to purchase an item. In the US, you had these specialists who would tell you, hey, this is great, that is great. In fact, Circuit City and Best Buy, which are very large electronic retail chains, Circuit City no longer exists, but Best Buy still does. Their whole success formula was that on the retail floor of the store, you had all of these agents who were so deeply embedded into the product chain. They understood. So if you went in, let's say, to buy a toaster, they would look at, they would understand what you needed, and then they would recommend something. But then as the world was getting more digital, and the associates were also getting less and less deeper, so their knowledge was more shallow as they started hiring high school kids. You needed information at your fingertips when you were buying gadgets or appliances. So the idea was, let's aggregate reviews across the web and then show at the point of purchase what the consensus is, and then the user or the buyer can make a decision on the spot.
So something like Rotten Tomatoes for movies or IMDb for movies. Right. So like that for gadgets.
That's right. Absolutely. That's the one. We created an initial beta. We also did a public test with the University of Texas at Arlington. A couple of the MBA groups did some tests. They came back with some suggestions. But before we could move into the next level, we had an early budding founding team, but issues of sharing equity and all of that came in, and a lot of misunderstanding came in at that point in time. So after the live, after that beta was done, the code base was given off to another company, and then the team sort of fell apart.
And this was with your colleagues at iGate or friends or
combination?
What? So then what next?
Then I joined a Canadian firm which was in banking financial services. Way back then, there was I've always been fascinated by payments. In fact, one of my scenarios when I was in my high teens was that I would go to the US, work there for a few years, and come back and launch a bank of my own in India. That was always the scenario that I'd modeled in my mind. So at that point in time, another idea that we were thinking about was to enable mobile payments in places like coffee shops, very similar to the QR code based payment apps we have today. And one of my friends that I was brainstorming with said, we need a original idea like Square, which had just launched a card reader back then. But the issue still was managing personal finances meant scanning receipts and stuff. So we said, why don't we look at that part? So again, we couldn't come to agreement with the starting point. And then I realized, okay, let's look at something. And I joined a Canadian firm called Minix, which was in banking financial services, in a solutions, innovation, and a business development capacity. I was there for about 3.5 years. I did some spectacular work there, built several models, wrote lots of thought leadership content. I also built the healthcare practice from scratch there, built it into a $30 million practice, and also opened began relationships with some amazing Canadian banks that the firm was struggling to break into for the last couple of decades. So, so that was, Minix was a fantastic organization. The people there, in fact, one of the few organizations that understood how to win in that at that point in time. Yeah, and there was amount of freedom that I had to pursue whatever I wanted, as long as it generated revenue. So that was Minix.
Okay, and you were staying in Canada.
I used to live in Texas at that point in time. And then, so yeah, going to Canada back and forth, there was something we was doing.
Okay. And by this time, were you married?
I was. In fact, around that time, my daughter was born. Maybe, I think 2007 was when my daughter was born. The financial crisis was unfolding, 2008 financial crisis. Very, very scary times back then, because my wife had taken a break because the child needed that support for the first 2 years. And it was only me that I was working, and I had changed streams from being in consulting and looking at all financial stuff to getting into something larger, into solutions, looking at operations. So it was a transitionary period. So yeah, that was when my daughter was born.
So around 2010, you started Mango Mobile. So this was while you were still at Minix.
That's correct. So while I was still at Minix, I started Mango. So in some sense, you can say it was that entrepreneurial itch that I've always scratched at whatever opportunity that I've had. There was a trend in the US at that point in time that we were seeing. The trend was grocery stores. As a result of all the IT boom, a huge Indian diaspora had mushroomed across multiple parts of the US: New Jersey, Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, Chicago, Texas. So common sight was that, and Indians love film, right? So, and if you're somebody who speaks Telugu and from the state of Andhra Pradesh, your fascination with films is even more greater. And my family being in the film distribution business, and me having had a first brush, had only brought me closer to it. At that point in time, there was a lot of homebrew comedy, I'll call it independent comedy, that was happening. And YouTube was sort of taking root. People were producing a lot of independent content. And I thought the Indian comedy scene hadn't been covered. And so I started an Indian comedy startup to bring in independent producers and help them create original content and get the word around. Didn't have a monetization strategy in my mind back then. It was not a time when you still had OTT platforms like Netflix, where people were willing to pay a certain amount. So the idea was monetization by ads. After building the product and launching with about 5 or 6 producers, I quickly realized that the number of independent producers in Indian comedy was way, way low. So in comparison, for the English content, you possibly had 10, 15,000 independent producers. So you could pick from them. You could launch a different genre. You could launch college humor. You could launch office humor. You could launch dating humor. You could launch stuff like that. In contrast, the number of Indian independent producers were no more than 60 or 70. And they were split across multiple languages, maybe 30 in Hindi, and even Hindi was a little early back then. And most of them were part-time. The ones that were producing Telugu content were all students who were maybe between semesters or maybe doing it just out of sheer hobby. So I made an attempt to produce some original content with a Hyderabad-based film institute, but the logistics were proving very nightmarish. So that gave me an insight. I already knew a lot about editing because while in my family's distribution business, I had visited dubbing theaters, I had visited sets, I understood the economics of what went into filmmaking. So at that point in time, there was still some connection to the industry. And in so this venture of Indian comedy gave me an insight into what it took online. What's a content delivery network? How do we popularize it? How do we set up a subscriber base? How do we use all of these online media? And from that expertise, we noticed something. When I say we, eventually, there was another co-founder. So we would go grocery shopping. So the general routine was Indians would work Monday through Friday, and every Friday evening you would go grocery shopping for the weekend to an Indian grocery store. And at checkout, practically every grocery store had pirated versions of popular Telugu films that had just released in Indian theaters, in Telugu and Hindi. So the way that industry works is if you take Bollywood as an example, or even Tollywood, which is the Telugu industry, they make upwards of about 300 films every year. And out of the 300, about under 10%, 30, maybe not even 30, about 15 of them have A-list stars who can command massive openings on the first day. Everybody else is obscure. And that is the case for India. But in the US, you couldn't command the same kind of opening because theaters are expensive to rent out and hire and stuff like that. So you only had under 5% of the films that made overseas. What that meant was 95% of the films were all limited to Indian distribution. You had some pockets of maybe places like UK where there were concentrated populations where these were released, but everywhere else the audience was really spread out, and theatrical release didn't make sense. So that's when we said, and when we looked at people, every single shopping cart would have at least 2 DVDs every single week. So, and each DVD, depending upon the quality, costs anywhere between $1 to $2. So we kind of did a back of the envelope calculation. Said, okay, you go grocery shopping 4 times a month, and so if you buy on an average two pirated DVDs, you're spending about $8 to $10. And Netflix OTT was just taking off at that time. They had launched it at $7.99. So we reasoned that because Indian content was so tough to get, the only way you could get your hands on was actually go to torrents. And sometimes the prints would be bad, maybe audio wouldn't be mixed. So it had its own challenge. And another trend was that flat screen TVs had just become all the rage. 2008, 2009, plasma gave way to LED. So it was sort of a perfect set of forces for a streaming media venture to take off. So that's when Mango happened. It was a coming together of 3 disparate, I would say, teams, because there was a content house, and there was a tech shop, and then there was us. We were actually the guys that dreamed of the product, the UI, UX, the marketing. So it just so happened that there was a content house which was trying to do the exact same thing. But their ideas were a little dated. So we partnered, we all came together, just like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel decided to merge and do PayPal. We came together, and we had initially, in fact, there was one more piece of background, which was we had bought our own films, a bunch of films, and it so turned out that they would take money from us. They would sign an exclusive agreement saying, okay, the rights to this film or these set of films are exclusive to you. And then they would turn around and then do a similar exclusive deal with 10 other people. Of course, we definitely had a great game going, but the fact that 10 other people had the same content did not leave us happy. And there was, since the OTT market was still emerging, there was no way to price a film properly. If it was a blockbuster, so for instance, back then, local cable operators ruled the scene, and City Cable and all of those guys, for instance, for a very large market, would offer anywhere between 35 to 40 lakhs. And the satellite guys like Sun Network, all of them had just started getting in, and they would offer crores of rupees for a film. And the OTT being where it was, we couldn't do any of that. So we were actually contemplating opening a couple of liaison offices in Mumbai and Hyderabad. And in the process is when we met that content house, and then Mango happened. So we launched. It was funny. It took off the first couple of months. We had a couple thousand subscribers, and then it got stuck there. So that's Mango.
So this was essentially like a Netflix kind of an app on which you could watch Telugu.
That's right.
And you were charging about $8 as a monthly subscription.
We were charging $7.99 as monthly subscription.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, why did it not really take off the way you thought?
So it's one of those paradoxes. The funny thing is, all entrepreneurial lessons tell you that, okay, go find out what's the most pressing need, and then serve that need. Flat screen televisions had happened, and this content, the day we launched, I think we had 800 films in our catalog, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me right. And that was an awesome number of films, because unlike YouTube, you didn't have any commentary, you didn't have ads or any of the other interruptions that accompany a YouTube video. And the reason for that, we were stuck in a limbo for about 18 months. We would just see 200 subscribers get added and then 200 subscribers leave. One of the reasons was, actually a couple of reasons, was the extensive, there was a website called Mega Upload, if you remember. And then there was Rapid Share. So they were like the Napster equivalent. It was very common to find pirated versions of films on Mega Upload and Rapid Share, and a variety of torrent sites as well. In fact, the problem used to be so big that under the US Digital Millennium Copyright Act, if you own rights to a film, you can send notice to an ISP or YouTube or any of them, and then they're actually immediately obligated to take down the content. And if the other person who put up the content comes back with a superior claim, then they can put it back up. In our case, we used to send an average of about 2,000 to 3,000 notices every single day to platforms across the world. Some would be in Russia, some would be in Northern Europe, some would be in Australia, some would be in Netherlands. So
Mango was a global business, like you were selling across the world.
It was the Western Hemisphere, so North America and Western Europe and Australia. Those were the target markets, because in India, internet hadn't yet caught up. The speeds were still very, 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 very low back then. So it was based. It was intended for that audience. So we were stuck at the 200, I think a few hundred. And then one fine day, it so happened that after 18 months, I don't know what happened. Well, let me back up. Somewhere along the way, there was some what the other there is another economic aspect around this. So, how does a pirated DVD even end up in the first place, right? So, because some are original copies. So the way it happens is an average film producer, has three sources of revenue. The first source of revenue he has is music rights. The second source of revenue he has is theatrical rights. And the third source of revenue he has is the money that comes from video, DVD distribution. So this was the time when DVD players were sort of going out. And if an average film cost about 3 to 4 crores to produce, in order to master a DVD and put out a few hundred copies or 1,000 copies, it would cost them anywhere between 55 to 60 lakhs. Right? So the economics of putting out a DVD were very high, and they would put it out. A handful of stores would carry them, and the weird thing was, all it needed was somebody to pick up one DVD, one original DVD, and make hundreds of copies of them and sell what was retailing for $20 for $1. So that's how they used to end up. And then there was a raid, an FBI raid that happened on a very prominent grocery chain in Dallas. So that sort of deterred other smaller grocery chains from carrying pirated stuff. It only gave us a small bump in numbers. So we tried all sorts of marketing. There were other internal issues that tied our hands. The way it was, the deals, the equity, and all the co-investing was structured internally. But we were still trying hard. But one fine day it so happened that the FBI decided, I don't know what they decided, why they did it. They shut down Mega Upload. And Kim.com, who was the founder, that guy was in New Zealand. He's a New Zealand citizen. He was, I think the FBI filed a case. Eventually, I think it was proved. I don't know if he was eventually extradited or not. But the net effect was that all of his servers were shut down. Mega Upload was shut down. And Rapid Share, which was, I think, based in Germany or Denmark, I don't remember, quickly sort of looked at what happened to Mega Upload and then took down all pirated content. And that was sort of the wind beneath our wings, so to speak. And then we saw a huge jump in subscribers, thousands of subscribers overnight. So that was sort of I would say, a demonetization equivalent event that happened to us. So that was truly coming of age. Yeah.
By this time, you had quit your job, or you were still in your job?
I stayed in my job. This was so the idea was, let's build this to a certain amount of scale, and then take a leap, because my wife was still a homemaker, and in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, jobs were not that easy. So the idea was, let's get to some level, and so I was moonlighting.
Okay. So after this demonetization event, what happened?
After that, the content house, which was the majority stakeholder, suddenly saw that this was a golden goose. And then there was they arm twisted us into exiting the startup. So it was a big lesson. I thought in 2008, when equity related issue had broken up a team, I took care to fortify that part. Unfortunately, if somebody wants to make a mess and they're hell-bent on making a mess, they will go ahead and do it. So in all fairness, the content house had contributed almost all of the content. See, it is one thing to fail in strategy when you're in a certain market. If there is one aspect to the success of Netflix, it is that Netflix took no sides. They were present in practically every goddamn platform that you could imagine. If you had a PlayStation, they would be on PlayStation. If you had Western Digital Box, they would be on Western Digital Box. So their idea was, how can I spread my platform or my app far and wide, which means even if there was a bunch of people with just 5,000, there was a device with 5,000 users, Netflix should be available on that. So their strategy was ubiquitous presence.
Okay. And it's still there, Mango
It's
Mobile
still there.
TV?
It's frozen in time, just as the way we left it.
So what was happening on the career front in the
So I
meantime?
was working at Wipro. I was head of a large practice.
And still in US
Still in
only?
US, all in US. So I went to the US in 2003, and then I was at Wipro. I was a country head for a practice, $130 million odd practice with a portfolio of companies. Um, I know we are on a podcast, but if I have to look back in my life, it's a dark chapter in my life. It's one of the most least meritocracy driven organizations that I've ever worked for. There is the gargantuan amount of politics that exists in that organization is just unimaginable. In most organizations, you see that there are a bunch of people that play politics, and there are a bunch of people that can purely do things on merit. But here, it was the only place where in my entire life I was not able to create any really meaningful growth. Till then, wherever I had gone, whatever I had done, I had created new frameworks, I had created new products, I had created new alliances, I had brought in, I'd done a variety of things because I've always been a thought leader myself. But for the first time, it see, organizations go through a state of decay sometimes. I think that was what was happening with Wipro at that point in time. I don't think that company has yet come out of the woods. If we see what has happened in terms of the leadership turnover that has happened, they've had a revolving door, so to speak. And very, very poor management of talent. And this is a sin that a lot of Indian companies commit. And that sin is that you just take people and keep throwing them against stuff that they are possibly doesn't suit either their interests or their talents. To be fair, the company had all sorts of programs. You could change paths every one year or 2 years. You could go from one division to another. There were things like that. But for some reason, the company was doing business. They were reasonable clients, but it was one work culture that I've never cherished being a part of.
Why do you think that was? Was it because Azim Premji stepped back and the next set of leaders were not as enlightened?
I have a slightly different view of those things, and it's a very common Indian syndrome of being satisfied with too little success very early on, right? My view, all of these leaders have done far more than I have, but my view is that any chief executive, any chief management should be in the market where you're selling and where your customers are, right? Almost all of them, including the likes of the celebrated Infosys, all of them had CEOs back here. And IT services was itself going through a drastic transformation from those large scale systems. Consumerization of IT was going on because things are rarely the same, right? And if you're not in the market, if you're not listening to customers, you'll be behind the curve. Take anything for that matter, whether it's blockchain or AI or any of these. We don't have any leading contributions on any of them, right? And that is just, and it's also a function of business models. So one business model. So for example, let's say if your whole life you have actually delivered only. Let's take the example of Blockbuster and Netflix, right? So Blockbuster had a retail store format. So they would rent out and then they would charge late fees and stuff like that. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about how new models take place. And new models actually take birth when disruption happens in a slightly different way. What it means is that you need to build a whole new division which is not fettered by the the models that come from a different business. So when you're in the retail DVD rental business, you are thinking about, okay, I need to buy 1,000 DVDs, they cost X amount of money, I need retail stores. So everybody in the company is oriented to that sort of economics, right? But when you start moving into streaming media, your economics change completely. Now you're no longer worried about DVD discs and their storage. You're actually worrying about servers, right? So what truly happens is you need to create and firewall a set of people and protect them from the pulls and pushes of the larger organization, which has a prevalent business.
Because the new business would also cannibalize the old business, so that politics would also come into play in terms of
See, if you firewall them, there is no politics, right? The politics, in fact, more often than not, keeping them internally engenders politics that actually kills the new thing, right? You actually have to separate them. You need to give them a lifeline, and you need to give them some amount of freedom, actually a great degree of freedom to take chances and then do something different. And the economic history and business history doesn't have too many successful examples of that. Two that really come to my mind are Pixar, which was actually the computer animation division of Lucasfilm. And when Pixar was headquartered, it was headquartered away from Los Angeles, it was away from Silicon Valley. So, and they were a totally different company, which did not really get fettered by a script that was written for another company, right? So they could truly forge their path. The other example actually is CarMax. CarMax, which was created by Circuit City. It's a fabulous story in creating longevity. So the Circuit City management realized that the electronics division itself possibly is not going to bring boundless growth. So they said, what is happening around, and let's do something. And they created a small team, and they kept that team completely outside of Circuit City. And so much so that today's the OLX cars, Car Dekho, I think Cars 24 that we see in India, they are all, and Room, yeah, they're all just copies of CarMax. CarMax became extremely successful. So what happens is when companies are creating new paths, they need to understand that they will disrupt themselves, and they need to be open to that. And they also need to firewall that. Skunkworks, being an entrepreneur, being an internal startup, all of that. And to a great degree, they also have to see, it's like this: if you plant a sapling, if you water it from morning till night and keep saying grow, 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 the sapling is going to die, right? You give it a certain, you put it in the right environment, and then give it a certain amount of fertilizer and water, it grows on its own. Because what you want is a resilient company, as something that creates leaps and bounds of value. So what that means is, it means that you abandon a well-trodden path. And that also means that you have to give up success that you possibly already have had till now, right? Maybe you don't always have to trade what you already have for something that you're going to have in the future. It only happens in careers. In my case, I've switched careers or paths like 4 or 5 times. The result has been that I've had to give up the success that I created in my previous one, and I'm in some sense starting from ground zero. But it has made me a much more well-rounded individual. But I know my payday is later. And another thing I think is that Indian companies don't create culture consciously. They do not create culture consciously, and strategy, see, contrary to what everybody thinks, strategy is not things on a PowerPoint and four vision statements and then telling an army of people go implement this. That's not strategy at all. In fact, our current coronavirus situation is a classic example of how not to do strategy. You can't do things one size fits all. If you had 20 or 200 hotspots across the country, shutting down a whole country is lazy strategy. People don't have to do anything because you just tell everybody to shut down and then pray and hope that it is going to take care of itself. And life very rarely works that way. So the conscious strategy is to look at all clusters. And because today our administrative machinery is district, state, and center, and the gram panchayats and taluk panchayats are not really that empowered. What it means is that you have 500 districts, and even in the 500 districts, we have most of the power concentrated in the hands of the chief minister. And what that means is that you have only very, very few people that are really thinking. And if that thinking is not happening in the right way, the whole country pays the price for it. So most corporate strategy is run that way. In my opinion, possibly what has kept us all going is that we have such a large market, and we have such a lousy situation for people to succeed and then raise capital and take risks. The existing guys get richer.
So then, what did you do in India? You landed up without a job, and what was the plan?
So in India, the whole idea was to build a startup. In fact, it was going to be a fintech startup that would offer the ability to for places like gyms and apartment maintenance, apartment communities that needed to collect money on a recurring basis to actually collect money. So in some sense, I wouldn't call it subscription billing, anything that needed a recurring payment on a regular basis. So that's the product that I wanted to launch. And it so happened that the payment scene was very, very, very fluid back then. The RBI was making all sorts of changes. Wallets were, there was the prepaid instrument or the wallets license, and then there was the payments bank initiative. The whole payments industry was in a big state of flux. So we said let it settle down, and we actually. So we said, okay, we definitely need to get something going, put a team together. So we realized that everybody was talking online back then. But India is a rich country with lots of variety. For example, in silk alone, you have 100 plus varieties. So no online platform can do justice to discovery and then commerce of stuff like that. So, and there was a rich ecosystem of the high street. So we realized that nobody was doing much about the high street. I've always been a big believer in touch and feel. So even in the US, while everybody goes gaga about Amazon, there is a concept called web rooming, which is you go into, let's say it's highly applicable in a gadget or an electronic scenario because that was the money spinner for Amazon for a long time. If you wanted to buy a television, what you would do is, Amazon doesn't have it on display anywhere, right? So you go to Best Buy, you take advantage of all the advice that store associate is going to give you. You make your choice. You just go place the order on Amazon, right? So that is web rooming. That works for electronics, but as soon as you step out of electronics, that thesis in some sense falls apart. So when you buy a sari, when you make 10 purchases in a year, maybe one or two of them can be online, but otherwise you want to try the sari on. And the best environment really is in the store because it's air conditioned, they've got all this stuff around. You can try 4 or 5. Um, we are not yet. If you watch the movie Demolition Man, which came out in I think the mid '90s, there is a scene when Sandra Bullock and Sylvester Stallone sit down. Sylvester Stallone is from he's frozen in time. So he and Sandra Bullock is from that era, and they say, "Let's make love." Sandra Bullock tells Sylvester Stallone, "Let's make love," and then Sylvester Stallone says, "Okay." And then they sit 10 feet apart, and then they're both wearing this headset, which simulates the whole experience. And so Sandra Bullock, moans and then makes some sounds and stuff like that. And then 10 minutes later, she takes off the headset and then she's done. She says it's done. And then Sylvester Stallone is like, what just happened? She said, we made love. And Sylvester Stallone is speechless. This is not my version of making love. So I usually give that analogy to say we are not yet in that stage where even stuff that is so intimate happens only digitally. So as much as digital evolves, that touch and feel can't go away. So that was the genesis to founding what was called as MADS. It was an acronym for Malls and Deals Around You. We launched the product in 93 days. Thousands of stores across Bangalore were visible on it. Our beachhead was.
You had a co-founder?
I had two
you were doing
co-founders
it alone?
at that point in time. One responsible for operations, the other responsible for marketing. There were three of us.
And did you get into this relationship differently given past bad experiences of co-founders?
The guy who was the CEO was my brother. And it was another mutual friend who was the marketing person. So we had good understanding of how the equity would be divvied up, and none of them were in a position to invest. So I was the sole investor. So we bootstrapped. So the idea was, how do we generate increased footfalls? People are deal driven, people are discount driven. So let us show them deals, and that's how Malls and Deals Around You was born. And we launched with Bangalore with a few thousand stores, and in about 6 months we had launched across 9 cities across the country. We had covered, I think, close to 40 or 50,000 businesses back then. All of it was bootstrapped. None of it was done with outside capital. We generated interest from VC firms.
So it would detect your location.
It could be for anything you wanted to do in your life. You're buying a car, you're purchasing a home, you're just buying food. It would show you a deal, and there were several exclusive deals as well. The funny thing is, even today, that's a lack. No app does that. Way back then, we used to have city-based competitors. So there was one startup in Bombay, there was one in Gurgaon, there was one in Hyderabad, and almost all of them did not have the original content we did. We maintained an army of people across all these cities, and started sourcing a lot of exclusive deals ourselves.
So isn't this similar to Nearby?
Nearby was launched eventually, but even today, Nearby doesn't really offer many of those aspects. How much of the independent stores does it cover? It doesn't cover them at all. See, the large chains are already present everywhere. They are not the ones that lack visibility. And if you see the share of the large chains in the overall commerce, it is in single digits, all of their shares combined, right? So it is the other stores that need that, and we had everyone. So for example, if you're thinking footwear, you look at Metro, you look at Khadims, you need to get all the local brands as well, because people shop there too. So that was what was happening. And we went through a pivot, which was in spite of all of my experience, a very bad decision way back then. But there were competitive pressures. the competitive pressures was everybody and his dad thought, deals platforms are great. And then every other week we used to see somebody launch a deals app. Never mind that nobody had anything original. So we should have just stayed focused and then continued to service that. Because today, for instance, if you even a large brand in India, they do not publish personalized deals. So, for example, if you are let's say there is a store called Project Eve, which is Reliance Trends venture. If my wife is a Project Eve shopper, and then if she shopped 4 or 5 times in the last 1 year, you should understand her behavior and then personalize and then help create a deal for her or an offer for her, right? That level of while that level of data exists, for some reason nobody's put anything together, and internally even marketing departments within Trends and then Project Eve haven't put in systems whereby they automate all of these. Everybody likes to brag about the CRM systems and technologies that they've implemented, but they haven't done this level of alignment. In the US, it's vastly different. You have an ecosystem. If you had top 100 brands, all of them would make their deals or offers based information available via APIs, and you would be able to get all the raw stuff. You could be focused on fashion, or you could be focused on electronics, or you could be focused on food. So you could launch your own because all of that would come directly from the brands. In India, the problem is the brands are still stuck in the past. They expect a lot from you and offer almost very little in return, even if you're a serious startup. So we set up our own inquiry systems. We set up our own. So we would call thousands of stores and then associates and managers on a weekly basis to find out what was running. So we created all of that back end ourselves. And in the midst of that, the stores came back and told us, hey, this is all great. We are getting some footfall, but we want to be able to offer commerce as well. And this was the time when everybody was courting the local store, the offline merchant, Flipkart, Snapdeal, ShopClues. So we were another in them, and we realized that we were present across 16 market segments. It was too big of a canvas size for just a startup of our size to focus on. So we took with the market also saying, hey, we want users to buy, not just visit my store. So we added an online shopping option, and that is a whole different beast altogether, requiring lots of capital. So that's the pivot we did, and in hindsight, both of those pivots were wrong.
So what happened then towards the end of it?
So we looked at data. We had, I think, 40 or 50,000 users at that point in time. When we looked at usage data on the Deals platform, we realized that the most popular was fashion and food, and food was already extremely overcovered. I think every sliver of it was covered, and one of our co-founders had actually done a cloud kitchen back then, and then he couldn't sustain, and he had just come out of it. So on the back of that experience, and then given the number of people that were jumping into food, we realized, we decided, although food was the most popular category, we said food is not the place to go. And food doesn't offer touch and feel. None of the local related hypothesis that we were holding was really relevant. So we said, where is our original hypothesis, all of that valid, and where is the user data leading us to? That was fashion. And in fashion, that is where the FLIT change happened. We called FLIT was Fashion Locator In Town. And that went through a series of transformations, mini pivots, if you will. And by that time, we had raised a round from a couple of friends, but unfortunately we ran out of that money, and we were faced with the stark choice of either keeping it, shutting it down completely, or having a very small team and continue to figure out, because we had just built the first version of the product, and we realized that without discounts and offers, users were not going to continue to shop on the platform, and that was not a game we were willing to play. We truly wanted to be creators of value, where local brands were discovered. If people were in the number one thing that the likes of Zomato do, although Zomato seems very focused on delivery now, is that where you live around, there are possibly 40-50 restaurants, but your top of the mind is just 2 or 3, right? And if you want to eat someplace else, that's why you pull out Google, that's why you pull out Zomato. And we realized that in fashion, it was even more pronounced. With social media and Instagram meant that if 3 or 4 people shopped at the same place, the chances of them repeating the looks was very, very high. So how can we introduce independent brands? And that was the hypothesis we had arrived at. And we had run out of funding. We had close to 40 people on rolls. So I actually let go of 36 people. And by mid 2018, we actually had a bunch of breakthroughs. The most significant breakthrough was that we could do pop-up showcases of brands across multiple venues, and that would do the trick of introducing newer variety, newer brands to people across the country. But we had, quite frankly, by that time, we had put in close to 4 years of effort. Today, travel is not a very popular thing to talk about, given there's travel has come to sort of a standstill across the globe. But people travel across the world, and people have to change wallets, currencies to pay for their purchases. So the idea was, let's launch one global currency that is accepted across all merchants, and we would play the role of the settlement. And the way that would get accepted was with the gift card payment rails. So we had already integrated with hundreds of merchants through their own gift card rails. So we would combine that and this, and then offer ability to shop locally with crypto, with our own cryptocurrency.
And you are here as a co-founder?
No,
you're
I'm a
part
team
of
member.
So in the meantime, you also started Maharajas of Scale. So tell me about that. What was the thinking behind that? And for our listeners who may not have heard of Maharajas of Scale so far.
So there is a forum called the Startup Leadership Program in India, actually globally. I'm a quote unquote mentor there. I coach and then work with a variety of startups. And while working with those startups, while I've done a lot of work in startups for more than a decade or so, I've held startup boot camps. It was okay as long as I was in the US to keep referring Valley stories. But as I moved to India, whenever we would give examples of common topics, user testing or product market fit or anything of scaling, hiring people, we would constantly, the examples or things that everybody would discuss would go back to just Valley examples, PayPal or Flickr or Yahoo. And we would have hardly any Indian stories, or maybe none. So, for example, and the ones that would get talked about would be just a handful of them. It's a trend that continues to fascinate me. For instance, in Hollywood, you have tons of A-listers. For example, Michael Fassbender, who played Steve Jobs in the Jobs film, is not really known as an A-lister. And if a similar casting decision were to be made in India, you possibly just would not go beyond the Khans, right? And that sort of trend sort of plays out amongst coverage for startups as well. the Paytms and the so-called SoftBank portfolio of startups get an outsized focus of media attention, so much so that practically everybody thinks that is all there is about the Indian startup scene. For example, there is a startup called GoCoop that has done a fabulous job of bringing weavers and helping weavers bridge the gap and then sell their merchandise direct to consumers. There's hardly any press about GoCoop. So there are stories, and the Indian market is truly different. So Mads itself, which I talked about earlier, is a classic example that e-commerce and online, as much as it is popular and then it could get big, that's not the only game in town. And the other data point is that in spite of all of Amazon's success in the US, the entire size of the US e-commerce industry is only 9.5% of an $18 trillion economy, right? So there were these stories, and I realized that nobody was talking about them, and the minimal platforms that existed out there had templatized it. It looked a lot like PR to me. I respect the stuff that they do, but when I spoke to entrepreneurs one-on-one, I realized that entrepreneurs had an amazing amount of experience to share. And none of that had made it out into the open anywhere. So that what that meant was that required very long, deep conversations with these founders. And then I realized that the podcast medium was the most perfect way to do it. Just put one caveat that while India has a lot of early stage startups, lots and lots of early stage startups, most of them possibly don't even have their founding teams together. It is not even bigger than one or two people, which is fine. That's how innovation starts. But then we need stories of people that had scaled, that had done things so that it could be an enduring story and not just an outcome of something that happened for a couple of years. So that is where the scale angle came in. That was the genesis of Maharajas of Scale. It's a podcast about building and scaling startups big in India. We only feature founders that have scaled, achieved a meaningful degree of scale. Again, the yardstick varies from one type of startup to another. A SaaS startup might have slightly different parameters. Let's say an FMCG startup might have a slightly different sort of parameters. But the whole idea is, have they achieved a certain degree of escape velocity, so much so that others could look at them and say, hey, they did that, and we could follow some of the methods that they adopted.
So you've spoken to a number of founders for Maharajas of Scale. So what are some of the things which you think would help you in your next startup that you've learned from speaking to these founders?
So there's one common format across all of them, and it's sort of a life lesson for startups, which is that the way startups succeed is you start. The first order of business is survival. You have to dig in for the long haul. And again, it depends on what is the hypothesis based on which you're building something. Some people build a team just to sell. They call themselves serial entrepreneurs, but they really haven't built anything. All they've done is a narrative, and they've given a semblance of having built something in a couple of years, and all they're doing is just building something for some large company to acquire, right? But if you are someone who truly wants to build something transformative, something that grows large, you have to understand that your time is going to come. But the first order of business that you need to get right is survive. And in many cases, you need to create communities, be conscious of growth much early on. A classic case in point is Zerodha. Until 2014, Zerodha was not even a tech platform. It was just a brokerage firm. Today, Zerodha has a very outsized presence in the Indian, financial investment community, purely because a couple of things came together. They already had a great community, and that even preceded Zerodha's founding, which Nitin had put together. The other aspect is about making sure you have eyes on scale from the very early on. And I would say these are mostly reinforcement points for me, because these were not things that I learned as a result of the podcast. But there are several key takeaways. For instance, in India, in spite of all the innovation that's happened, nobody's really solved for trust yet, right? So cash on delivery, things like that. We've seen a lot of payment innovation, but no innovation has happened around trust, and that's true across the world as well. So building global products from India is possible. Talent is possible.
From our conversation so far, I can pretty much guess that you would be the type of person who gets restless being in a job, and you would always be looking at something to start up. So do you have some ideas or thoughts on what could be your next startup?
I do. In fact, I'm helping a friend of mine, again in the fintech space, because that's a space that has fascinated me for a very long time. And the whole notion around the trust is what he's working on. I've only started dabbling in it. It is a little early to say anything, but you'll see something soon from them for sure.
Beyond Campus is a production of the Podium.in, powered by Career Launcher. If you like this show, then we are sure that you will love our other shows on subjects like entrepreneurship, marketing, books, and drama. Check out the Podium.in for a complete list of all our shows.